In the interest of time, we'll get going. I'll ask if we can't, Michael, if we can close the doors. Yeah, if we can close the doors. Michael, you got to close the doors. All right, well, we will gavel the meeting to order. I want to thank our witnesses for joining us today. We're looking forward to your testimony. I'll dispense with my opening remarks, but just to summarize and make sure that they get put into the record. We know that People's Republic of China, more definitively the CCP, has been manipulating the world marketplace, and for that matter, also the human resources and how it exploits and develops minerals and other critical elements of what they need to fuel their economy. We know there are human rights abuses from the efforts that they've undertaken, unfortunately, against the Uyghurs, but also in other places around the world where they, for the most part, use slave labor. They exploit populations and nations for their own benefit. You just don't see any sort of economic relationships that are to the benefit of the host nation. They're always to the benefit of China, and always, unfortunately, exploiting the human beings in those countries and their natural resources, both to the detriment of those countries. We know things that are happening in Xinjiang and the Uyghur population. The first hearing before our full committee was about the atrocities committed against the Uyghur population there. We know, too, the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act was signed into law in 2021. We know how incredibly important that effort was to send a message to China about what is unacceptable in the eyes of the world. The challenge is that people are so intimidated or co-opted by China. Rarely do they speak out, or rarely do they take actions that have a meaningful impact on China, which is problematic from our standpoint. China is what I call a transactional coercionist. If you look at what they do and how they structure agreements with other countries, it's always to their benefit, and it's always to the detriment of the countries and the people of those countries. The question is, how do we gather enough efforts around the world to counter that? China has a significant power advantage on many of these countries that they look to exploit. And the challenge is these countries don't have the wherewithal to stand up to them because they have such, economic ties that essentially determine the success or the failure of those countries, that there's just not the effort necessary to be able to do that. It's only with the world standing united that we're ever going to get to where we need to be. And there's the recent updates to the strategy by the Forced Labor Enforcement Task Force identified some new high priority areas, especially the mining of aluminum and other critical minerals. Those things, I think, have to be put into place. It's very easy said, much more difficult to do. So we have to strengthen our efforts across the world. We have to engage partners. We have to engage partners in a meaningful way. We also have to find ways to lessen the reliance on China. We have to make sure partner nations can look to us for sourcing of these minerals versus being reliant upon China. We also need to be seen around the world as being the advocate for human rights. We can't talk out of both sides of our mouth. We can't say, hey, we're going to stand up for human rights and then continue to enable China, or to allow China to go without consequence for the things that they do. So today's hearing is about getting a little more of your sense about the things that we can do, specifically what are the policy objectives that we need to pursue. So with that, I'm going to yield the floor to my colleague, Ms. Castor, and ask her for her opening comments.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome. Thank you all very much. This is a great bipartisan committee where we are working together to tackle the challenge of the strategic competition with the Chinese Communist Party. This special working group on critical minerals, this is our third meeting. So you all are here at the outset to help us craft some policies that the Congress ultimately can pass to empower our domestic industries, and then I think Wittman's point, that we have to do this with allies and partners across the globe. So your input today will be invaluable. We don't want mining to be a race to the bottom, and we always talk about that in terms of environmental sustainability, but the same goes for exploitation of people. And we want to set a high bar moving forward as we build up our domestic minerals industry. So thank you very much for being here today. I look forward to hearing.
Well, Kathy, thank you. We're going to go to our witness, and now I will introduce them. We have Mr. Mattis, president of the Foundation. He's going to discuss the congressional intent of the UFLPA and the actions of the Forced Labor Enforcement Task Force to date. We have Ms. Emily de la Bruyere, senior fellow at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies and co-founder of Horizon Advisory. And if you will close the door, please. Sorry, I don't have to talk about the din of the voices in the hallway. Ms. de la Bruyere is going to be here to discuss the PRC's industrial policies, highlighting the connection to forced labor practices and the impact on global critical mineral supply chains. We have Dr. Jennifer Hinton, group manager at ESG for Jervois, and she'll share her expertise on environmental, social, and governance practices in the global mining industry. Dr. Hinton, we'll begin with you.
Great.
We'll go down with our panelists.
Thanks to you all for the opportunity to speak to you today. My name is Dr. Jennifer. As you mentioned, I'm group manager of ESG for Jervois Global. Jervois is an Australian company. We're focused on establishing ethical, responsible, and Western-focused supply chains for cobalt products specifically. As we know, these are essential for the clean energy transition, as well as for national defense and other industrial applications. Our business spans the upstream supply chain for cobalt, from mining and refining, manufacturing of downstream cobalt chemical products. Our customer base is currently in Europe, Japan, and the US. In the US, through our refinery in Finland, we meet about 10% of US demand for cobalt products. So in addition to Jervois, Finland, we have Idaho cobalt operations. I know you've heard all about Idaho. It's the largest cobalt mineral deposit in the US. We've invested over $150 million to date. And due to the decline in cobalt prices, we suspended in March 2023, sadly. But we also have on the horizon a future U.S. refinery where we'll bring Jervois, Finland's 50 years of expertise in technical operations and ESG, hopefully to the United States. We're currently completing a bankable feasibility study for this new refinery under the Department of Defense Award Title III. So sustainability. We're extremely proud to talk about Jervois, Finland. It has an exemplary track record in health, safety, environments. We've been exceeding our energy targets since 2002, and we're well on our way to meeting a 2035 net zero target for our carbon emissions. We recycle water 6 times prior to discharge. Around 99% of our non-hazardous waste is recycled or reused. And 15% of our production comes from recycling of cobalt. So we're extremely proud of that performance and excited to bring that those bona fides to the U.S. In addition, our key message to our customers, whose alternate suppliers are mainly Chinese, typically Chinese, is that Chinese companies are not our competition. We operate to completely different ESG standards, and we're pleased that our customers actually choose us despite the abundance of low-cost cobalt, as you mentioned. However, today there are still many customers of cobalt who do not choose cobalt and pay for high ESG standards. As we know, approximately 3/4 of the world's cobalt is mined in the Democratic Republic of Congo, DRC. And in our industry, we typically think in terms of quartiles on the cost curve for global production. So if the DRC is the bottom 3 quartiles, and by default, the remainder, including Idaho cobalt operations, is in the highest cost quartile. Idaho Cobalt Operations also operates to exceptionally high ESG standards. We have a high bar, comprehensive management systems. We have a community benefits agreement underway, conservation and biodiversity programs, for example. This mine will never produce cobalt at an equivalent cost of Chinese mines within the DRC due to the standards. Just to clarify, to provide a bit of background on cobalt in the DRC, there's three broad groups producing. First of all, artisanal miners, which we hear about in the media, and is a concern of this group with respect to forced labor and child labor. This is only about 10% of cobalt production in the DRC. This material is brought by middlemen, typically Chinese firms. The second group are semi-industrial operators. They account for maybe 30% of production. These are partly mechanized, often with very poor labor and environmental standards. And these are typically operated also by Chinese companies, with output often being intermingled with the artisanal production that I talked about. Now, the other category are large industrial operations. They produce roughly 60% of the cobalt coming out of DRC. And they're essentially like mines that you would find in Canada, Australia, the US. They operate to extremely high international and Western standards for ESG. Happy to talk about that more in the discussion. And we know this because our Finland refinery has been sourcing from these large industrial operations for many years. We became the first downstream cobalt refiner globally to be conformant with the Responsible Minerals Initiative. And basically that's a third-party assured system, third-party audited system that shows that we're compliant with the OECD due diligence guidelines for responsible mineral supply chains. And we do a lot by way of not just due diligence at the outset, but throughout as our operations or as our business relationship continues, including going on the ground. So we're proud of our performance, and we're proud to seamlessly extend these standards to the U.S., hopefully with the new refinery and with Idaho cobalt operations developing an integrated supply chain for cobalt in this country. So we know cobalt demand is forecast to double by the end of this decade to about 390,000 metric tons, and Western governments are rightly concerned with the impact of this increased demand on forced labor and other human rights abuses associated with the Uyghur region, associated with DRC, and elsewhere around the world. But translating this increasing demand for cobalt into demand for responsible sourced material must be a priority of all Western countries. There are actionable measures that can be taken almost immediately. First of all, we need a domestic supply chain to be resilient in the face of any supply chain threats, which we're concerned about in light of current geopolitics. So adoption of a resilient resource reserve mechanism is something that can be done quite quickly and see a rapid impact. Your committee actually recommended the adoption of this type of mechanism in your December 2023 report. And based on our combined decades of cobalt market experience, we recommend that the committee support a cost-neutral pilot mechanism that would see a credible floor price and a ceiling price established for each of the commodities listed in your report. Companies could voluntarily draw support when prices are below the floor and pay back when prices rise above the ceiling. This is relatively simple, low administration costs, easy to put in place fairly quickly, and it's a direct way to immediately deal with Chinese market dominance and improve supply chain resilience here in the U.S. Second, I think I'm running low on time. Strengthening requirements for supply chain due diligence to keep unethical sources of cobalt from entering U.S. supply chains. I'm sure we'll get into longer discussions on that, but there's a lot we can learn from what is happening in the EU and with respect to the OECD guidance that's already existing and what our other allies are doing in Australia, Canada, etc., and also what's in place here that we'll hear more about. And then finally, with respect to the UFLPA, the Uyghur Act, it would be useful to clarify and strengthen the consumption requirements. There are responsible producers of cobalt like us, but understanding the exact criteria and evidence, we're sure we have the evidence already based on our due diligence program, but it would be nice to ensure that we're not going to delay or impede not just our business, but that of our customers and consumers. And finally, the U.S. has a broad range of impressive instruments in place for refining and downstream. The IRA in particular has been transformative for the refining side, but for the upstream, for the mining side, for extraction, to develop an integrated cobalt supply chain. We encourage you, and the most powerful thing I think this committee could do is introduce a cost-neutral pilot of the Resilient Resource Reserve. So thank you for this opportunity. I'm very happy and looking forward to discuss.
Very good, Dr. Hinton. Thanks so much. Now go to Ms. De La Bruyere. And for your testimony, yes.
Thank you, and thanks for having me. It's a little indulgent, but I think it is useful framing. I'm just going to start with the high-level pillars that operationalize Chinese industrial policy. And the first is that there's a clear overarching goal, which is to establish the dependence of the world that other countries and companies depend on. Beijing then converts that dependence into leverage, influence, and coercive power. How does China do this? Through a process that starts at the upstream of value chains, dominance there, and then works in a system of vertical integration down the value chain. This means that Chinese downstream players are able to benefit from upstream capacity and leverage. And of course, that's how you establish dependence, especially from a non-market approach. And then that leads to how tactically this is operationalized. Chinese industrial policy is funded by non-market state support, and it's fueled by human rights abuses, including forced labor. Also other normative risks like a total disregard for environmental regulation, but that's beside the point, while also being on the point. The consequences and risks of this are evident and don't need underlining, but I will underline them anyway. And that's that in critical minerals and metals, as well as in other fields, we depend on China. That dependence means the U.S. and other countries cannot produce security relevant products, among other things, without China. It means that companies cannot function their business models without China. That puts Chinese companies and the Chinese security apparatus at a competitive advantage. It also means that our hands are tied as a global system. Even where there might be ideological resolve, there is not realistic resolve to respond to what China is doing. And then, of course, there are the normative implications, which is that as long as we depend on China, we depend on a program of forced and abusive labor, among other normative threats for the functioning of our economic and security systems. I'm going to focus just very specifically on Xinjiang and lithium in particular, but other critical minerals and metals there as a particularly striking case of what China is doing, the normative risks that includes, and the degree to which, even in an environment where awareness is very high, U.S. policy has failed to stop the problem, and then go into very high level of possible approaches. China holds less than 7% of the world's lithium reserves, but it has 70% of global lithium processing and 80% of lithium ion battery cell production. Which leads to a different point, but just prefacing it, even in areas where China doesn't have upstream advantage, like the actual mineral production, it has invested heavily in processing such that it can still control the value chain. And yes, China has massive resource endowments, but it also has real will to capture those resource endowments at other places, especially where they are of relatively consolidated supply, like lithium, like cobalt in the DRC. In China's lithium posture, Xinjiang is a major player. It has China's largest lithium mine and China's third largest lithium resources. It's also a hub of lithium processing and production. For example, last year, almost exactly a year ago, the first phase of China's largest battery-grade lithium carbonate project was put into production in Xinjiang. That's important, A, for showing that this is an emphasis in that region in particular. It also shows how China operationalizes its critical mineral and metal program in the Xinjiang region. That processing project is in an industrial park that's government controlled. have brought in not only that processing project, but other processing and downstream lithium companies, so that they're all together in an industry cluster. They also work with China's major downstream users of lithium, for example, cattle and other EV companies, to make sure, A, that their processing products fit into their value chain, and B, that they then get used. So you see the vertical integration process at play, and also the perfect interplay between Chinese industrial policy and the ecosystem of Chinese human rights abuses, namely Xinjiang industrial policy, or industry zones. That's just one example in the region. Xinjiang's rich in other mineral and metal resources, including, I'm going to read these because there's no way I'll remember, nickel, cobalt, manganese, graphite, cesium, tantalum, niobium, and beryllium, to name just a few. One tidbit, without that beryllium supply in Xinjiang, China would depend on the US for production. So not only do these resources in Xinjiang allow Beijing to secure American independence, they also prevent China from relying on the United States. And then thanks to PRC industrial policy support and prioritization, the region has also become a hub of processing. This is where the aluminum case becomes really relevant. The primary aluminum, Xinjiang is China's second largest source of primary aluminum and growing. That aluminum isn't produced, like there's no actual resource endowment there that drives that. It's because there's an industrial policy that says this is going to be our processing hub. We're going to lower environmental regulations because it's our priority to bring heavy industry into Xinjiang, because that's how we colonize this place, and also that's how we make sure that the world can't do anything about what we're doing in the region. All these lists could continue. One of the most striking things, though, is that the players who are operationalizing this approach in Xinjiang are the very well-known players that have already been identified and hearing that penalties enacted against them by U.S. policy. And they're continuing and they're growing their footprints. Over the past few years, the UFLPA entity list has had additions that include Hoshine Silicon Industry, the Xinjiang Zhongtai Group, and just this month, the Shenhua Group. Their operations in Xinjiang include graphite, carbon, Hoshine, in addition to silicon precursors, also does graphite and carbon, and primary aluminum. And those companies, as well as others like them, have only increased their investments in the region over recent years. And then the Xinjiang Production and Construction Corps, or SPCC, which is a paramilitary group that really runs Xinjiang and operationalizes the genocide there, and has been sanctioned by the U.S. Treasury Department for doing so. They also mine critical minerals in the region. They invest in companies that are mining and processing them, and they prioritize those in their industrial policy. That leads to the final point really in this rant, which is that it's no surprise that Xinjiang has the place it does in China's critical mineral and metal supply chains. It's a very deliberate function of Chinese industrial policy, which has said that these are priorities and they are going to be priorities in the region. And the Chinese companies operating there are backed by state funding, and that allows them to dominate markets and prevent any competitive threat to them. And that really gets to the crux of the problem, because as long as there can't be a market competitive threat to them, you can have Band-Aid after Band-Aid and regulatory action after regulatory action, but market forces against this non-market policy are always going to act in its favor. Because you can only tell companies for so long that they shouldn't buy from a cheaper or an alternative. High level then, what can actually be done about this? I think first, there are tactical things, continuing UFLPA actions, expanding lists, enforcing lists, making requirements clear, like with any question of presumption. There's also, though, a high-level recognition, which is that the coordinating structure for China's forced labor abuses is its industrial policy. You can't separate the two. So the support from that industrial policy has to be seen in the U.S. as constituting entanglement with China's forced labor program and general human rights abuses. At the most basic level, companies that receive support from Chinese industrial policy should not be getting preferential policies from the United States. Ultimately, they should also not be able to access the U.S. market if we want to really remove forced labor and other human rights abuses from our system, but that's a second and more difficult step. Second, and this is a little more tactical, one of the things a lot of companies have done to be able to continue to operate in Xinjiang and also access the US market is to build two different supply chains. A clean one that doesn't rely on Xinjiang, a dirty one that does. That's not a clean system. That's still a company that's using slave labor to fund itself, fund its business model, and perpetuate that system. And as long as US policy allows that as a loophole, we're not actually stopping China from doing anything. And also China will use opacity to circumvent our regulations through that approach. Because all you have to do is point to one supply chain that's clean and say that that means the company is. And then of course, and this is a big question, there needs to be an alternative. As long as China dominates upstream critical mineral and metal supply, this problem will continue. And that means incentivizing and rewarding private sector and multilateral investments in wholly independent and wholly trusted supply chains. And that has to be from an approach that looks across sourcing, processing, and financial backing. There are way too many cases of quote-unquote trusted companies being funded by China or operating in one node of the supply chain that either relies on or then sources to China. And that's not an actual independent or trusted supply chain. And also, the US government should signal the resolve and longevity behind all of these policies, because if not, the market isn't actually going to respond. And ultimately, nothing actually happens until the market has internalized that this is a problem and that there is an opportunity for proactive investments. And finally, of course, and this has already been said, but US international partners are necessary here, and it's critical that it be clear to them that if they want to sell into the US market, they should mirror US policy. And of course, that should be paired with incentives, a positive part to invest in the upstream production, especially in areas where the US lacks capacity. But again, the good cop is great. The bad cop also has to be there, and the US market should be messaged as something that goes only to players who are free of forced labor and human rights abuses. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Peter, we'll go to you. Get your perspective on UFLPA and where the Forced Labor Enforcement Task Force is today. So look forward to your update.
First, thank you very much for hosting this.
Thank you.
It's a great pleasure to see some of you.
Yes.
And also, your interest in the subject is not just a conversation. Mr. Torres has attempted to make some edits and fixes to problems with the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. Unfortunately, I don't think it's quite made it all the way through correct. Yeah, because there are clearly some things that we left undone as we work through this. I'd also like to know, since we're talking about the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, in Senate Joint Resolution 111 from 1959, the third week of July was declared Captive Nations Week, and we talked about communist enslavement of Turkestan, which is really the area that we were talking about. Yeah. And it's worth remembering that on a bipartisan basis, I believe it was written by Senate Democrats to talk about communist enslavement of these peoples, not just there, but in the Baltics and elsewhere. But this is still part of the captive nations that have not yet quite made it out. I think state-imposed forced labor is a challenge that we were not really prepared for. When you think about how we thought about forced labor legislation going all the way back to its inclusion in Smoot-Hawley 30, this is a view that, maybe it's an individual factory, maybe it's, a few bad apples, but it's not necessarily a whole system, right? And that we're looking for signs of forced labor of a company hiding pieces or, having a sweatshop on the side. We're not talking about the provision of mass state surveillance into, what might be effectively called an open-air prison, as some have called Turkestan today. That law enforcement is on the side of the abusers, not at best a neutral player or people that are interested in rooting out these kinds of problems, right? They're reinforcing this sense of control. And so this, I think, requires a legal response and an enforcement response that goes much, much further than what we had previously done. And this is made worse in part because of the information asymmetries that exist. And there are two of them that are quite important. The first is that in all of the hours and hours that I spent talking with companies while working on the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, it became clear that many companies do not know their supply chains beyond who they have direct contracts with. And even some of the best ones knew maybe a tier or two beyond companies that they had direct contracts with. But when you think about all of the moving pieces that might be the gold in a computer, right, trace elements, this may go through so many tiers that companies, even good companies, can't keep track of it and can't know it themselves. And then the second piece of this, which was informal in the early days and became formalized in state security legislation in the PRC this year, is that there's been a deliberate state effort to prevent people from knowing what is going on at the factories and companies with which they work. And they've actually been classified as potentially as state secrets. So in some sense, if you are a company digging into things, you are violating essentially the classification rules, as you know from your hearing on risky business last year that really explored some of the problems right in an investment context. But this is a very similar piece. And companies reported that as early as spring 2018 that their investigators and due diligence people were being detained or arrested. In some cases, Chinese nationals were simply disappearing for what were routine business operations. And there were a lot of companies that actually made the reports to the U.S. government, to the Department of Labor, to say, hey, we're concerned that something is going on. So, again, companies are not all bad, but they have actually, and in many cases, they were reporting that there were issues, and this is part of what made us move. The second point is that forced labor within and without the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region is a key pillar of the PRC's genocide of the Uyghurs. As Mayor Kohler testified last year to this committee, that mass detention and forced labor are ways to create a prolonged separation of the sexes to prevent cultural transmission, to separate parents and their children. And it's hard not to recognize that this is that moral component, as Emily nicely said, called it normative issues, right? But given that we are, I believe, the only country that has declared as a policy that this is a genocide, for us, it is more than just a moral issue. It is a question of how we respond to atrocity crimes that we've identified. This forced labor issue has been widely reported across industries, and as I've said, it goes across a number of different pieces, right? You have everything from the raw polysilicon to extraction to processing to the solar panels. You have from the lithium mining extraction to the batteries. It's worth noting that CATL, for example, based in part on the work of this committee, is very clearly relying on products that should not be entering the United States in the first place, and that we would have a U.S. company thinking that it could do a joint venture with CATL with lithium that should not be eligible for entry into the United States is a testament to some of the shortcomings that we have in the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act enforcement. And then there are companies like BYD, which was identified as a company involved in labor transfers. And when BYD sued ASPI in Australia for reporting on their involvement, every single time ASPI was able to present additional reports and find additional news about BYD accepting labor transfers, shockingly, within a few hours of delivering that information to the lawyers once again, that information would disappear from the Chinese internet. And it was not simply BYD saying that, oh yes, we've accepted these labor transfers. It was BYD, it was the local governments saying we've accepted, and here's how we're complying with national policy to bring this across. So this is a problem that requires a massive challenge, and this is why the rebuttable presumption was chosen as that tool, as a way to think beyond it. But at the same time, there was also a question of, well, you can't just draw a line around the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region and use that border to matter, because otherwise you're creating an incentive to accelerate genocide. And this was the whole purpose of the entity lists and the labor transfer lists, was to make sure that there was a marking for what was taking place outside of that region, outside of that specific boundary. And this is something that I've looked at with a little bit of disappointment, that when you look at how the entity lists have been used, yes, it's useful to list companies inside the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region to help mark them for companies who might not be able to do that research themselves or might not dig too closely. But at the same time, its main purpose was to identify companies outside that were participating in these programs. And to date, I don't think that there's yet been a labor transfer program that has been identified, or a parent assistance program that has moved labor, which is supposed to be one of the main ways for targeting. I think there are a few things that are worth thinking about. There has been a lot of complaint about how the United States is starting to look more like China because of the attempt to wield a scalpel on, a high wall, small garden, to be very careful on how things have been approached. But because of those information asymmetries, wielding a scalpel is going to be unpredictable, right? It's difficult for congressional staffers to go digging into it. It's difficult for executive branch officials to go digging into it. They may not have time. They may not have limited resources. They may not be trained investigators, right? These are all things that are part of the issue. And so, in some sense, we create unpredictability by trying to wield a scalpel because we don't always know exactly where it is and how far you can cut and how far you can go. So, the lessons that I drew from this experience, from working on the legislation, from watching its enforcement, is that the rules need to be kept simple, because if you create exemptions and carve-outs, then companies and U.S. government agencies will focus much more on the carve-out exemptions than actually dealing with the bigger issues in the law. So keep it simple, give people time to comply. The second is that consequences create risk. This was one of the issues, frankly, that we failed on in the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, is that we did not create serious enough consequences that made those risks not worth taking, right? If there were criminal or civil liabilities that were incurred, would Ford have ever entered into those discussions about a battery factory in Michigan with CATL? I think the answer is no. But because there was not necessarily those kind of serious penalties for doing so, they didn't see a meaningful risk for them not to do it. And that would have continued and gone ahead, arguably, without this committee's intervention. Third, you also have to appropriate for an enforcement expertise. Things that are actually quite natural to people in the private sector. And you could think of things like inventory management, different financial incentives, different, the value of a contract versus having a grant. Things that are not necessarily, or that they don't necessarily think. And you need some of that expertise inside government to watch how business is done. Take place, both from an investigative standpoint and a protective standpoint. And then you actually have to investigate. You actually have to have the expertise that's there. I have to say I was quite disappointed that, if you remember, a couple of years ago, there were big House and Senate bills about competition with the PRC. And yet nowhere in any of those bills was language training, in any effort to build expertise. And we at times have people using Google Translate to do desk research that when you look at the work that Emily's company does, when you look at the analysts writing for the Jamestown Foundation, you can't do this in any meaningful way without very good Chinese language skills. And you can add this in a number of different places, but it's an important component of this. And lastly, I'll just leave this, since it was discussed, sort of this non-market and market issue. Right? We want a fair playing field. But we also need to recognize that what we're dealing with in the PRC is someone who's not playing by those same rules. And we're pretending like if we just spend more time on the practice field, if we just study a little bit more film, we can wander out and prepare ourselves to be on that field. But none of that matters if you're walking down the tunnel and someone breaks your knee with a crowbar. And in many cases, that's what the PRC is doing. And this is where we have to think about how do we have to protect ourselves, because you have to protect your kneecap, so to speak. And you have to do those things for competitive action. It's not an either or, it's a yes and that these efforts to protect ourselves and to build competitiveness have to go sort of hand in hand going forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. I thank our participants today and your perspective. We'll now start with. So I want to go to the overarching issue here, and that is, we've come up with a structure about how to address what China does in exploiting human beings and the things that they do to try to gain an advantage. Ms. Bruyere, you talked about China's essentially dominance of the value chain, from beginning to end, and what they don't have, they coerce themselves into. They create these relationships that hold other countries at essentially at their mercy. They're very exploitive. I call them transactional coercionists. I mean, that's how they do business. As you point out, Peter, they're willing to break some knees along the way. They've also become very adept at circumventing practices that we try to put in place to make sure we disassociate these importing goods made with forced labor. You know, CBP has that responsibility. I think it's many times very difficult for them because the Chinese have gotten incredibly adept at obfuscating connections between the companies that do business here and the CCP and forced labor. So they essentially are better at countering our measures than we are at coming up with measures to try to prevent that. They're very adept at co-opting and coercing folks too, just by the very power of what they can do within the marketplace. So they essentially hold people hostage and they say, by the way, yeah, you can be high and mighty about what you say you will do about these products, but by the way, we control them. So, you know, if you get too high and mighty, we'll just cut you off. And then these countries don't have a whole lot of choice. The only power that we have is to work as an entire entity that counters China. That means with our allies, and that's still a difficult place to be because unfortunately our supply chains, our value chains are so overly reliant upon China. The only way I think we ever get to a reasonable measure of enforcement is for us to, you know, disassociate ourselves with these key components in these Chinese supply chains. And listen, we're not there yet, but I want to get your perspective about, you know, what additional things can we do in the current situation in addition to decoupling, disassociating, whatever you want to call, from the elements of what China does to dominate the value chain. What additional things can CBP do and others to make sure that we are doing everything we can within our power to enforce and try to also to get our friends and allies to be there with us? You know, many times what we see is our friends and allies say the right things, but when it comes to actions, many times they're just not able to do it because of the power that China holds over them. And China knows that, you know, and China smiles and says, oh, you know, we're not doing all those things. And then they, as you said, Peter, great analogy, you know, they take the pipe out and break some knees if they're not getting what they want. So I wanted to ask all the panelists for your perspective on, you know, how do we do that on the current situation? And as we're trying to come up with policies and legislation that, you know, decouple as much as we can ourselves and our allies from this dependence on China, and making sure too we break through what now is China's countermeasures to embed as much as they can a separation between the CCP, forced labor, and what happens in the marketplace. Dr. Hinton.
I think we go back to due diligence being increasingly. I mean, think of the evidence that would be requested, say, under the Uyghur Act. It would be looking at how do you prove the origin of your material? How do you prove the steps taken before it gets from the mine to the refinery, from the refinery to the next step, and so on. And that's becoming, at least in the cobalt space, and it has been for about 10 years in things like tin, tantalum, tungsten with the Dodd-Frank Act since 2010. So now cobalt, especially amongst companies that are considered to be responsible. You know, the companies we source from are conformant with RMI, have third-party audits. We audit ourselves. It is becoming increasingly the norm and more familiar for in the cobalt space. It might be new, say, for other commodities like lithium, graphite, et cetera, but it's being discussed. And then having external auditing processes is extremely important and helpful and maybe can help expedite. But refineries in general are becoming like a node of information. You know, we might source from 20 places, but if we're same degree of due diligence on those sources on an ongoing basis, it could be helpful. And then in that case, you know, we can draw it from what OECD has in place and what legislation perhaps in the EU, this corporate sustainability due diligence directive, as one example that looks at broader human rights due diligence.
I think three of things I would harp on, and the first goes to your point about information and also the ability to raise that information. yes, China's an opaque information environment and getting more so in areas that are sensitive. As Peter said, second information is raised about forced labor ties in Xinjiang, that disappears. It used to be that in companies' annual statements, it said supplier 1 is this, supplier 2 is this. Now it says supplier 1 X, supplier 2 X, and you can see the percentages that they supply, but increasingly for companies, especially in sensitive areas, there's no supplier listed anymore. All of that makes due diligence much harder. That said, there actually is now a U.S. legal measure that trumps that. The buttable presumption, as in the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, is a really valuable tool because it says, okay, you're an opaque information environment, well, now prove that you're okay. And that should be leaned on more and also expanded into other U.S. measures that are intended to counter an opaque Chinese adversary, because that is how we get around them just not telling us anything. They're also, and this is incredibly tactical in the sidebar, but the ability to raise information about China is a real problem too. Beijing plays offense, and this goes back to the breaking the knees. There are certain companies that everybody who's looked at any of this knows have major exposures to forced labor, but we also know that they're highly litigious. And like, find me a small company, which is what most of we entities looking at this are, that does due diligence that's willing to go up against a major Chinese company that's going to sue their pants off. And I don't know what kind of protections exist for that, but it is a problem. On the resolve front, I think perhaps the biggest problem in terms of U.S. actions with respect to forced labor in China is that there hasn't been a signal of actual resolve. Other companies and U.S. allies just don't think there are consequences of continuing to do business the way they do. We, at my company, a lot of our work is doing due diligence on supply chains to vet for forced labor. We have two kinds of companies. One are companies that have gotten their goods seized. The other are companies that are incredibly ahead of the curve and define themselves around social mandates rather than around business models first. That's it. There are a lot of other companies out there that should be really worried, that are in fields that are prioritized by the UFLPA enforcement. They don't think that there's going to be a problem. And they should be worried about that before such point as their goods are seized. And the same goes for U.S. allies and partners. There's no actual sense that they're going to be pushed into a corner on any of these things. And finally, and I think this is the point Peter made a lot more eloquently than I did, is this is a systemic issue. It's about China's larger system. It's not just about forced labor or the Xinjiang region. And that's where China's systemic role in the international system is a question. The biggest answer, I would argue, to any of these problems is PNTR. And that recognition was given to China on the assumption, with real, human rights obligations written into the text. And until you either message to the rest of the world that China might be taken out of its current role in the international system, or actually take China out of its current role in the international system, the consequences of what Beijing is doing won't be internalized.
So, it's the first one that some of these specific standards about what constitutes clear and compelling evidence actually need to be made at DHS and CBP. And that was something that was deliberately avoided in the legislation because, to say, that's not really Congress's job to develop the specific rules and how this gets enforced. And there were several people who were former government officials that were lobbying against the bill who had to be reminded that, well, when you were in government, did you want Congress to legislate to that level of detail? Okay, well, that's a good point. The role of Congress is really to let out that big rule, to lay the clean, simple guidelines, and to give the implementing agencies the ability to do their job. Some of those were done quite well, other parts were not done as well as they should have been. So again, the resourcing question, I think, is a big one there, right? Because a few years ago, it's somewhat better, but CBP's forced labor investigations team, was roughly about the equivalent of 28 full-time government, right, to cover all of the world's forced labor problems, right? That's a bit rough, much less to add in the volume of goods that comes in from the PRC, through sort of normal channels or the de minimis channel that the committee has also raised repeatedly. The second issue on enforcement, I think, comes to congressional oversight, which is that the administration, whether it is simply the way the bureaucracies have worked or whether there's any kind of political guidance, I don't mean that in a political sense, just the executive branch has decided that things like the entity list have to be done with a high standard of evidence, despite a federal judge ruling that the rebuttable presumption is about risk of a widespread practice, and that really any sort of notice or information suggesting that there might be an issue should be sufficient to justify the entity listing, not trying to get past a reasonable doubt or some other high standard of what that should be. So actually executing on what the law says and why a rebuttable presumption is a recognized trade tool, even under the WTO, as some trade lawyers point out. On working with allies to find parallel legislation, because I think this is a big risk. As with the WRO on cotton from the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, with the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, there's been a clear drop, according to some of the companies that do testing and look at these things, to say that this cotton has actually reduced in its importation to the United States. It has increased in Europe and some of our other allies as a result. And when you look at the modern slavery laws in the UK, Australia, and a number of other countries, they're essentially voluntary statements that have no consequences, right? To go back to that point of you need consequences to create real risk. And we have a lot of inter-parliamentary vehicles for conversations to take place. There's the Helsinki Commission. There is the Inter-Parliamentary Alliance on China. There are all sorts of other engagements and caucuses that can be used and have been used. And, you know, in some sense, it's about finding our champions in some of those other places. You know, I actually have no doubt in my mind that there would be a Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act in Australia if the late Senator Kitching were still alive, because of the way she pushed and championed human rights there. But we need to find those ways. We need to strengthen them. We need to work with our partners in framing how those laws are, because without this engagement, you know, there are always going to be reasons to not do something. But I think that it's the legislative side that has created an impetus and a great push. And then with this enforcement, whether it comes from greater enforcement of the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act or whether it comes from some other areas, we should be thinking about things like what the Wolf Amendment did for the space industry. You know, one of the reasons why SpaceX exists is because it prevented the PRC from playing inside the space industry space. And therefore, you had a lot of private sector innovation that then was mobilized by a particular individual and a particular company to bring together, you know, kind of novel and interesting product. And if we're looking to do this in some of these areas that are under a lot of pressure from the PRC, we need to be thinking about how do we block them out very, very quickly so that we keep our industries alive, we keep some of the capability alive rather than losing it. Starting from something is a lot better than starting from zero.
Well, your testimony in illuminating with excellent. Thank you very much. So, Dr. Hinton, you kind of give us a breakdown of the law coming out of the DRC with 40% really the artisanal miners and semi-industrial controlled by Chinese, and then 60% to large industrial operations. And you said there is a distinct difference between the standards there. Walk through a few of the differences.
What labor standards, having, you know, for the non-performers, artisanal is basic technology, basics and shovels and hammers, no people, personal protection, about as basic as you can get in terms of digging holes in the ground and very manual labor. But an important livelihood for about 40,000 people. It's a poverty-driven activity. People were driven by poverty into this activity. And so that's why the U.S. Department of Labor, for example, and other international organizations are working to support formalization and improvements of artisanal mining. Right now, they don't meet the standards. So companies like mine, you know, would never even think of buying from them at this point. And then the semi-industrial are quite often licensed. They have licenses in licensed areas, but people likely to be working without contracts. Again, very basic safety standards, poor environmental practices. semi-organized operations, but nowhere near the standards that we would expect in the United States or elsewhere. And then the larger operations, I encourage you to go and visit and see them. Extremely high-tech, organized, each employing maybe 10,000 people with good contracts, good medical care, like easily verifiable, visibly verifiable things in terms of how people work, the technology employed, things we would see in the US, strong environmental management systems, extremely good healthcare, and actually one of the biggest taxpayers in the DRC are some of these operations are some of the biggest taxpayers, biggest employers, and having been to sort of assess some of these operations 2 years ago and then a few months ago, in those 2 years, you see the town of Kolwezi now visible improvements in terms of development. So when you think of mining being an engine for wealth creation and poverty reduction, you can visibly see through highways, new shops, new stores, vibrant economy, etc. You can see that impact on the local economy, and then major community development programs, and that's a big impact in the Congolese legislation. Companies that are licensed are required to have community development type agreements, and you can see those active on the ground. So you can't have a bigger gap between having a positive impact on development versus working at standards that are definitely subpar.
So the 60% that's to higher standards, that goes into supply chain across the globe?
Yeah, and this is actually a good argument for increasing refining in the United States and in other countries, because we're sourcing. Our refinery in Finland does have a limited size. We can't take all the material, but there is a will for companies that are best performers to look at alternative refining capacity outside of China, because that's where 90% of the refining capacity is. So I think in terms of looking at so-called clean or responsible supply chains, building refining capacity is an important step.
But it implicates what Peter is our, any other tools that we need to bring to bear to help direct these supply chains and adopt some guardrails. So you said that the EU is moving in a certain direction, and OECD, what are they doing?
So OECD isn't an such as Responsible Minerals Initiative that has a standard with third-party audits. OECD develops standards and guidance to follow, and because it's developed in such a comprehensive way and informed way, the OECD due diligence guidance for responsible mineral supply chains specifies, sort of how we as companies are expected to assess risks, verify risk, mitigate risk, and in some cases even terminating business relationships or not even going into a business relationship, and actually assessing things like traceability is becoming increasingly important, how you can verify. And so OECD is more like a guidance and standard setter, whereas actual assessing is a role for other organizations. On top of the due diligence guidance for minerals, there's OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises, which basically looks at environmental and human rights due diligence, which mirrors the UN guiding principles on business and human rights, which recently has been captured to an extent in legislation in the EU through something called the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive that requires environmental and human rights due diligence with consequences for not doing that, or in the case a company is found to be connected to a human rights violation or especially responsible for a human rights violation, there's real teeth.
So we can set this, they can create this template. The EU is doing some things, but I'd imagine across the globe where there really aren't any guardrails that are in place to.
Yeah, I think because it's a global sector. I mean, You know, we have a refinery we're refurbishing in Brazil. If our customer is BMW in the EU and they're subject to that standard, they're still having a requirement for, say, the refinery in Brazil to meet those standards under that legislation. So.
Just add a small point. The refining and processing is one of the key ways in which the PRC is leveraging things. So when you look at the supply of rare earths, yes, China has big deposits. If you're looking at cobalt, if you're looking at uranium, if you're looking at the range of these issues. But if they control the refining capacity, then they control those standards and they control the inputs. And to the extent that companies are actually able to make a business here in the United States or elsewhere in terms of extraction, they may be forced into joint ventures simply to have access to the processing, right? And so expanding the processing and refining capacity, creating incentives to expand that is one of the first things that we can do to kind of break the PRC chokehold and pressure point for ensuring that companies.
This point on China's industrial policy where they have industry clusters, vertical integration, and as we look forward to our domestic supply, domestic processing, we probably need to do something like that through rules-based.
But thinking about it also as what the PRC is doing when it can't dominate the entire value chain, when you can't control, say, all of extraction. They went for processing and refining because that's the nearest choke point. We're thinking a lot about semiconductors and other integrated circuits. And that's an area where the PRC can't control all of those pieces as much as it's trying to position itself for the future. But where they have gone very heavily is in printed circuit boards to kind of the next level up on their application, right? And this is an area where there's perhaps a lot than in rare earths and other kinds of refining processing. But it's the same sort of thing where the PRC can't dominate those specific things. They're looking for a choke point, kind of the next level up to force people to funnel things in. Seafood processing, is another example.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Everybody's comments today. I'm sitting here, we had a China Select Committee hearing this morning and talked about AI. And, the threat of China being able to get ahead of us with regards to artificial intelligence is very real. You're going to have to compete and compete hard to be able to stay up with them and perhaps take the lead on it. But it seems to me that if you back all this back down, we have a situation here where we need to be able to control these rare earth minerals, and I think Peter just mentioned, there's a choke point here where these guys have realized if they can have the smelters or the places where you refine these different types of minerals, that's actually where you can control the whole process. And I think, we have a problem there, and how we get to where we are going to be willing to set up our own processing plants to be able to do that, to be able to compete, to be able to mine our own minerals, to be able to get our own refineries and refractories, whatever they may be. Because to me, I think it boils down to us as a country having the resolve and the attitude toward China that we're going to push back. And if we don't push back, they're going to push us off a cliff. And we just said that if we don't find a way to control more of the refining ability or our the ability to produce these finished minerals, we're going to control the process forever. We have to find a way to control that part of it, and we have to invest in that. We have to be able to convince people that I think China's a threat. I sometimes think that we don't really understand just how difficult and how big a threat China is. I think people are starting to wake up. I think the balloon as it went across our country was a big wake-up call. It went right across my district, and I'll tell you right now, everybody in my district knows what a threat China is. But if it didn't go over your home or your community, it was 2 states over. Did you really figure it out? It was just a balloon that they were up there trying to look at a few military bases, and we finally shot it down. And so do we really understand the threat? Do we really care about the threat? are we really ready to push back and do what it takes to stop China? I mean, one of the things that, we talk about also is the money it takes to be able to make this all work. We still have our own companies, our own people, our own asset managers in this country that invest in China, invest in these companies, and give them the capital to be able to compete against us. So I guess my question is, at what point, or how do we wake up the American people to change their attitude toward China and make them understand they are a very, very real threat? We had our tabletop exercise, and when China invaded Taiwan, I tell people at home about that. I said for 6 days, I said there was no resolution, and it didn't look like there was going to be a resolution for a long, long time. We lost 2 aircraft carriers, we lost half our airplanes, half our long-range missiles, and we couldn't count the dead on Taiwan. And you know what happened? They sanctioned China, and what happened then? They nationalized all American assets in China, and now all your retirement funds are gone. When you wake them up and say, my retirement funds are gone, yeah, if you had them in China, they're gone. And finally, you grab their attention. But what does it take to get the attention of the American people to understand the significance of what you all are telling us today? This is a really serious issue. We've got to find a way to control these rare earth minerals to the extent that we can protect ourselves. This is a huge national security issue, but are the American people aware of it? I don't think so. We had a little concern about this when the COVID hit. We had realized that 95% of our pharmaceuticals came from China, and well, what are we going to do about it? Well, they lip service to it so far. I don't see much change. So I'm very concerned. So I'm just kind of curious if you guys got some ideas on how we can energize the American people by seeing the threat that's really here, so we can do what you guys are talking about here to be able to enable us to be able to protect ourselves down the road. Let's go down the line.
That's a tricky one, but I did want to highlight and then comment on
National security and welfare is tricky.
how to inspire people and make them aware of the threat, of the vulnerability of the U.S. having virtually no cobalt stockpiles, even though it's used in things like aerospace and defense, and what happens if, geopolitical instability, etc. It is a real issue. But in terms of investing in refining capacity and the downstream, in terms of batteries, etc., I don't know how many billions of dollars of projects have been approved or are occurring in the United States as a consequence of the Inflation Reduction Act. The EU, this is why allies are important, have countered that with their Critical Raw Materials Act and are similarly investing not the same billions, but substantial amounts of money in developing the refining capacity for the reasons that you cited. Making people aware, I think you're better positioned to answer that than me, and others might have a comment. But it is critically important. I mean, the vulnerability, I don't think people have a sense of what it means. COVID was a good eye-opener, but with respect to cobalt, I know it's a vulnerable position. So.
There's a messaging challenge, which is, I think, in large part why this committee exists. And it should be a narrative that's coming out of the U.S. government that what China is saying is accurate, and what China is saying is that we're at war with China. And it's that simple. And I think there's all you have to do is just take Beijing's language and give it to the American public. And that should be a wake-up call, and it should be the clear language, which is the one sentence: they see us as an adversary and they're out to beat us. Also, though, we are America, and therefore it has to be clear that you can make money off of competing with China and protecting us from China, and that you will lose money if you don't do that. And right now, that's not clear. Just to pick on the IRA for a second, if you look at the number of solar projects that have been funded by the IRA, about 50% of them involve Chinese companies. So right now, the message that the government is giving out is that you can make money by having your cake and eating it too, and working with Chinese companies. And there's a defensive element, which is that that's not the case. There's also a proactive element, which is that the government needs to create an environment in which it is a money-making proposition to defend us. If you look at the processing question, what does that mean? That means China's advantage here is not only subsidies, but also low-cost energy and low environmental regulations. Quote unquote, provide the public goods that are necessary to compete with that. So quote unquote industry zones where there is low cost energy available. And that's not picking winners and losers. That's creating an environment where you can have industrial capacity. And then at the same time defend against China and the human rights abuses and the environmental abuses in their value chain so that they're at least partly removed from the system. And then I think one last beat on this is all of the narratives about China and about other threats in our ecosystem are currently siloed. And I think they all stem from China and they all stem from the same Chinese approach. You mentioned AI. The problem in AI with China is exactly the same problem. I have an analytical problem where I make everything the same thing, but this is a case where it's the same problem as the critical minerals problem. China is working to control the upstream and the processing, to have a data advantage and to have the computing power advantage. And that's going to make them win AI. And it doesn't matter if we have open AI, if we have the best algorithms. They're going to take those, and we're going to depend on their computing power, and they're going to have better data, and they're going to beat us. And that's like a pretty simple story. And you can say the same thing in every field that people care about. And so instead of having all these disjointed messages on the question, we need to say, here's what China's doing. It applies to every field, and that's going to mean that they're going to eat our lunch. And there's just where's the simple message on all of that? I think that's what it's up to the U.S. government to do. Take this, to make it palatable, and to make it very clear to all the different interest groups that right now are pitted against each other in what should be a unifying front.
So the first is that we have to remember to talk explicitly and specifically about what the challenges are. I think research security is a great example of a place where we failed to talk specifically and explicitly. We see people writing off this as a problem because, oh, well, it's just a few grant issues or it's some mucked up reporting requirements. When really what this is that we're Al Caponeing the problem, right? Going after Al Capone on tax evasion worked because everyone knew what he had done. Everyone knew that he was involved in murder and extortion and bootlegging, right? So you could go after on tax evasion and it was fine because people could say, we still know what this is about, right? But going after some researcher on screwing up grant paperwork does not look like you're actually dealing with a research security challenge. I would also say that, remember, that Americans are already losing money. When the Evergreen property bonds issue, when they said they will not reimburse foreign creditors, there was a massive drop in pension holdings in the United States. And it's because people had not been listening to a warning over and over and over that they shouldn't do this. And yet these are some of the biggest funds that manage pension funds in 50 states. And I think this is an example of here's something that we should be talking about, but good luck finding much that connects us directly to people, right? And that's an example where there would have been, I can guarantee you, there would have been someone in your districts that was affected by this. The second, in terms of being able to talk openly and specifically, if you go back to how things used to function, the federal broadcast information service, or the foreign broadcast information service, used to make a lot of information readily available. And you could get access to a news portal. It was very easy to access as a congressional staffer. It was very easy to find information. It was taking just foreign broadcasts and making them accessible in English so that people could read them. There's whole volumes of scholarship that were built about this. Not only was it great for making information readily available to people who wouldn't be able to read it otherwise, but it was also good, as you guys know, in dealing with the intelligence community or the defense community, right? The classification gets in the way of an honest conversation. And then you start wondering when you're out here, well, what can we say? Can we ask this question? Can we think about this piece of it? They used to publish, it's a long time ago, but they used to publish these books of the material that was disseminated through FIPIS. And so it meant that you could have government people and academics show up at a conference, and basically they could look at it as well, if it's in the book, then we can talk about it, right? So it gave people a common ground for understanding. And we have disseminated less and less and less. The tools are less and less usable. And at this point, like, if you think about some of the complaints that your staffers from Level have, it's that they have huge problems in getting access to information, whether it's what's taking place inside the U.S. government, whether it's what's taking place inside companies, or whether it's what's taking place inside foreign lands that would be difficult to report on. One of those is actually pretty easy to solve. And so we do need to think about the idea of an open source agency again, because I hate to say it, my former employer, the Central Intelligence Agency, is not a good steward of this kind of information, and ODNI has not been able to manage it. And I hate to say, create a new agency, but this is a place where people need to respect that the discipline and effort that goes into collecting and processing this information is worthwhile and needs to be supported. And third, and this I think gets back to the issue that's at the core of the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act and other pieces, is that we don't want to be complicit in the PRC's current model of development. And we need to remember that their model not only has these features inside the system of human rights abuses, but it also relies on access to international basic research, because their system is not good at making the kinds of meritocratic decisions about how you would put out money and distribute money in a non-political way, right? Because basic research is hard because you're investing in, I don't know what's going to come out of this. And that's something their system is not good at in terms of, and that's why they try to draft off of ours through talent recruitment programs, through all of the other efforts to gain access to U.S. labs. You can see talent, you can see the role of capital, right? It's not necessarily about money, they have plenty of money, but there are ways in which capital is allocated from the United States that people are thinking about it, and they go and do other things. Not to mention it drains our own system of money that could be used in other places, right? So if we are able to chop off these pieces that make their system work, force them to be more political on their own, and we'll be opening up resources that are better exploited and better used here in the United States or with our allies and partners, where there are plenty of meaningful research connections and plenty of meaningful ways to commercialize technology.
I've heard the word, used the word systemic. There's a whole system with labor that extends. The opacity of the information environment is national in scope. These problems are national in scope. Why don't they live on Xinjiang? Why don't they extended nationwide program?
It should be wide throughout China. It currently is Xinjiang, Tibet, Mongolia, but regardless, that's beside the point. It should be extended throughout China.
I think part of it was this is part of the challenge that Mr. Lückemeier was highlighting, right? This is a big thing, and we see parts of it. People look at one piece of it and they see that. They look at one piece. And there's the head of a storied China studies program in the United States who, when Proclamation 10043 came out, said, well, I don't know what this military civil fusion thing is. It must not be a real thing, despite the fact that it was made a national strategy in 2015, that it was all of these pieces. And it's because it's hard to keep track of all of the different pieces. If we can make the argument and we can do it, then it's certainly something to push for.
The reason is you made a powerful point of shifting the burden of proof. That you saw, if we presume that everything is problematic, that the burden falls on you to develop us. I feel like that's an element of solution to the problem.
I agree.
Just pray on this repeated. We've spoken about the world's dependency on China for so what are China's vulnerabilities with respect to government that we can potentially exploit?
China does have some critical mineral dependencies. So at a simple level, you can take a chart and beryllium, for example, just top of mind because it's written down here somewhere. High purity quartz, I believe, is another. But you can run down the list on the table and have the very direct. Here's something they depend on us for. And then they also, as Peter just pointed out, depend on the U.S. is a different version of the question, but for downstream capabilities, so basic research, high value add technologies, and for markets. And one of the things that China is very good at is if we put pressure on them in one place, putting pressure on us in a different place. So it's not like a one-to-one comparison, and that's probably a playbook we need to flip on them. And an example in doing this in the other direction is when they restricted export of gallium and germanium and said, okay, you're saying trump card in the high value out of the semiconductor value chain. Oh, wait, we control the upstream. But Beijing should be worried that if they threaten us in one place, we're going to use a different type of weakness against them. And then you also get into a bigger question of not just where do they depend on us, but where are they, what are their vulnerabilities and where are they worried outside of dependence? And, for example, China's terrified of our military strength. It's one area where we still have an enduring advantage. There is power to messaging that, to saying, okay, you should still be scared of us militarily. And we're going to position in such a way that we're going to activate those concerns. And that's not currently something we do because we respond very much in a one-to-one fashion.
Just another kind of broad point. The PRC is something like 31 to 33% of the world's global manufacturing. They are something like 13% of the world's market. So by putting pressure, by blocking off goods, by creating sort of a system of barriers for those goods, you're now upping the amount of subsidies and the amount of pressure that they have to put on this. And if they either don't rebalance their economy with some of the issues that creates internally, they will simply have overcapacity. They will be no longer functional in some of the.
So can we, in the context of critical minerals, can we recognize barriers without sabotage?
In critical minerals, probably not. I think it's our but they need access to our markets, and this is where Emily's point of we can respond in other areas, and keeping it as a one-for-one, keeping it parallel. This is one of the ways in which they have paralyzed, in some cases, U.S. policymaking over decades, because they can pit the U.S. government and other governments against each other, right, internally, because this agency has this priority, this agency has this priority, and no one's going to say, well, yes, we'll accept our agency's priority being taken off the list in favor of someone else's. So this is the point of where if we are able to respond in different areas in different ways, and to make it clear that China's non-compliance on this creates consequences over here, that's where that pressure can be used.
The good I think there are companies that are concerned about reputational risks. How do we create a reputational incentive, or in other words, how do we publicly shame into consuming responsible actors?
Yeah, I think it's already happening. A lot of our customers, they actually have vision under the Inflation Reduction Act for an entities of concern. We're starting to see an uptick in interest in our material and hopefully some willingness to pay a bit of a premium. I think that is increasing. Those pressures are working, those levers. Consumer awareness, it goes to public awareness again, is also increasing. I mean, there are. RMI is a certification program. There's about 17, 18 industry ESG standards with third-party auditing. So different companies or customers are expecting the refiners and the upstream to be certified against. It's happening slowly. Cobalt, some of these critical minerals are very different than, say, copper, nickel, where you have Rio Tinto, BHP, massive companies with huge resources to do, a lot with respect to ESG and certification. In the case of cobalt, companies are, there's some big ones, but they're smaller size. So you have to be a bit careful that you don't kill the little ones in the process of putting in expectations. But I would say the downstream, the customers are expecting it more and more. And then through legislation in different countries, it's becoming more the norm, which is positive. But we, again, need, extraction mining outside of DRC, hopefully in the US, to sort of mitigate that vulnerability, and then greater refining capacity in other countries, and miners will sell to them.
What is the price differential between a responsible actor and a Chinese company?
Oh, I couldn't tell you, and I think we've been trying to quantify it. I think my colleague Wade, who was here a few weeks ago, he would be the best one to tell you. But there is a differential. And well, actually, to be fair, I mean, because the cobalt is being mined with copper in DRC, I mean, some companies are making no money off of cobalt. They're just making money off of copper, and you know, intentionally low cobalt means cheap batteries. Cheap cobalt means cheap batteries, means cheap EVs. So, yeah.
Well, let me just close with one comment. You know, we know the practices that China is willing to use to dominate the world. So it isn't just the United States that's at the mercy of China. It's what they look to do to essentially implement their vision of the rule of law. I mean, they are not in any way, shape, or form held to what the international rule of law. They want to create their own universe. And listen, they're willing to underwrite their efforts. They're willing to take losses on things. They're willing to participate in unfair market practices, things that make it very difficult for systems of free enterprise and open governments like ours to be able to compete with them. They're very adept at putting lots of information out there that's incorrect and buttressing their own efforts. So it's very much a situation where we just have to call this for what it is. I mean, China is willing to lie, cheat, and steal to accomplish their needs. And I think we just have to be much more candid about that. I think the days of believing, well, we can't say those things because it's provocative to China. You know what? We're well past that point. I would argue the more provocative thing for China is for us to show weakness, because China is very, very much about exploiting, and they will look to bully us, and you know, just like the bully on the playground. You know, if the bully kicks you in the knee and you get up and dust yourself off and say, please don't do that again, you can expect that the next time it's going to be even worse. But, you know, if you punch the bully in the nose, all of a sudden the bully's a little bit more hesitant to do that. We as a nation, I think, do not do enough outside the headlines to really show that we are serious about counteracting China. We don't have to do things that embarrass China or do things that, you know, put them on the world stage and feel like they have to, you know, accelerate their efforts. There are a lot of things that we can do that we've been hesitant to do because we're worried about them being provocative. I argue that weakness is a bigger provocative action than a strong effort that's not in the headlines against them. So I just think those things are critically important. And from that standpoint, too, you know, as I said, China doesn't abide by any of the rules of any other nation that looks at, you know, respecting its populations, respecting its resources, you know, respecting all the other things that we believe in. So I just want to get your perspective about where our efforts should be, and really calling out the Chinese for what it is, and then having our allies call them out and say, hey, listen, here's the bottom line is, you know, we have views of the world, and I think we're at a point where we have to, you know, call the Chinese out for what they are. When we do that, they are very sensitive to that. And I think that's the thing that makes a difference. And then too, when we pursue strong relationships with allies, that perturbs them too. You look at what they're trying to do with Russia, with North Korea, and Iran, and anybody that will play ball with them and trying to play it as though it's a partnership. There are no partnerships with China. But what additional things do you think that we need to be doing to really, I want to put China on the defense. They are continuing to play offense in almost every realm. You know, how do we do things to put them on defense? Peter?
You know, something that's worth noting that when you look at the things that we've done with entity lists and sanctions, just on the merits of the justification for doing what we've done, in-spur sanctions or entity listings, Huawei type things, that we have worldwide, it's somewhere around 600, 700 Chinese companies, maybe getting a little bit higher. But that's what it looks like worldwide. But it's a universe of something like 500 or 600,000 companies just on that logic, the logic that we're using alone, right? So we actually have a lot of space to do a lot of things. And I think that's the main point of it. If we're going to take action, we've actually got a lot of room to do it and to keep a sense of like the horizon's quite big.
Yes.
And that also to get in our heads that we can have a bias toward action. I mean, one of the interesting things about the latter half of 2020 is that there were all of these things that the Trump administration was doing. Very small, little things here, 16 entities listed, a speech here, an arrest here. And the PRC couldn't respond well because they couldn't think of parallel responses. And when the end of those actions took place in the early days of the Biden administration, March 2021, and things stopped for a moment, the PRC sanctioned a handful of lawmakers and individuals in the European Parliament. And they had done more than anyone was able to do for the previous 18 months to kill the comprehensive agreement on investment between the EU and the PRC, right? They overreact when they're given that time, but they're not very quick on decision making. So I think that's one of those things where when we know that the universe of some of our tools is quite big, we can take lots of actions that don't give them a sense of response, like a proper way to respond. And as you know from your work with Ask, this is one of those things that is freezing us in the Western Pacific of how do we respond when it's this little piece here and there. I think that's the main thing. We push back by being a bit faster and realizing that if we want to use a scalpel, right? A scalpel is a surgical tool that you have to use over and over and over. Can you imagine your surgeon like having you on the operating table and saying, okay, we're going to do a cut. Now we're going to watch what happens for 3 months, then we'll see if we need to do another one, right? That's kind of what our attitude has been, and it needs to be, if we're going to be surgical, we need to be doing it faster and faster and faster.
Yeah.
And that, if we have that attitude, we'll be able to do a lot of things under the radar. We'll be able to do a lot of things about sanctions evasions. We'll be able to do a lot of things about how Hong Kong continues to be misused and as a workaround without ever really crossing that headline threshold, but make things very complicated for the way that the PRC operates.
Our alliances should be strengths. Right now, they're weaknesses because the PRC is adept at using the weakest one of our allies or the weakest set of our allies to influence and access us. Mirroring our policy should be a requirement for allies to maintain the benefits we give them, including access to our market. I think Mexico USMCA is a really good example of this. The reality and risk it poses, and a potential way to show a response. And then I'll go back to what at some point I said was top of my list. We should revoke China's permanent normal trade relations status. And that's how that was the original sin of U.S.-China relations.
Great point. It goes all the way back to President Nixon and his effort to try to unfreeze relationships with China. That was the beginning of where China began to take advantage of that. And now they've gone, even taking advantage of it. Dr. Hinton?
Yeah, I just agree on that urgency and taking action now. But running parallel to that, it's just an observation. There's a lot happening in critical minerals in the U.S. government, a lot of agencies involved. There doesn't seem to be a coordinated strategy. Not to undermine the actions that could and should be taken now in terms of the scalpel and not to interfere with that, but there should be sort of a national coordinated strategy that defines who's doing what our priorities are, what our targets and ambitions are, and then measuring progress towards them.
So I agree. We're on legislative and policy perspective on that. The good news is this, that a lot of people interested in this, there are a lot of ongoing efforts to draft legislation and put it forward. The bad news is there's a lot of disparate efforts that are putting the legislation together. And, the challenge always is when you end up now with this interest in 18 different pieces of legislation, is there a way to coalesce that in the remaining portion of this Congress, which after November becomes a lame duck session, and then you have essentially the first 100 days of a new administration, whoever that may be, and what they have to put in their priorities. So all of a sudden now you're another 12 months behind where you need to be, and China doesn't have that to deal with. They have command and control, so they immediately react. So, our effort is to try to get something of substance out that essentially has an all-of-government approach with this. Even though it may be less than perfect, I think it's important to send something out, just to send a message to the Chinese that, we're going to do some things that are going to, address this in a full frontal assault. I just think that you have to be very mindful of the level of effort that China is willing to put into this. And we have to be unafraid of being very assertive in that. And, I argue that weakness is even more provocative than a very assertive action by the United States. And if we send a signal to the rest of the world that we're going to be assertive, we'll have a lot of people, I think, that will go along with us, but they're not going to do it by themselves because of the risk. If we're willing to jump out front, as the old saying goes, I'm behind you, but right now our allies are way behind us. So the question is how do we get them to come up and really, be with us on these things? They're going to be difficult. Initially, they're going to be difficult because China's reaction will be, as they always do, is, very, very aggressive actions to try to counteract that. But what we have to be able to do is to withstand that, and I think we can do that for short periods of time, and then I think China will eventually see that that's not a good long-term strategy. But they've been able to bully their way through this, and as long as that behavior benefits them, they're going to continue to do it. And we've been less than assertive in opportunities that present themselves. So anyway, we just have to stiffen up our spines and get to work. But listen, I really appreciate your coming in today and giving us your perspective. I think it's incredibly important to get this perspective on what we have to do. There's so many different layers of this. We're trying to dissect all of those and make sure the policy we pursue, is reflective of everything, not just the resourcing, the supply chains, but also, the human rights aspects of this, the economic aspects of this. All of these things are interrelated. And if we do it in the right way, we can use all of these issues to our benefit in how we develop policy. So I cannot thank you all enough. Please continue to stay in touch with us. You all do great work on a daily basis and will keep us informed, if things change and you said, hey, listen, think about this, or you need to be aware that these conditions have changed. Those things are very, very helpful to us and things that we're doing here. Even though the select committee is indeed one that is a conduit of getting information together, it does provide lots of good, valuable information for the drafting of legislation and actually making change. So, some good things have happened in the past. The key is how do we put a little bit of rocket fuel in with that today to get to where we need to be. So thank you all again. I will adjourn our meeting here, and thank you all again. Please continue to stay in touch, and thanks